Hey everyone, welcome. We'll give people a couple of minutes to join in, but I really appreciate y'all coming today. So, today we're going to talk about bridging the engineering and compliance mindsets. So, who am I and why is that important? Well, my name's Milan. And so, from an engineering side, I spent many years as the release manager, development operations owner, and compliance owner for a $5 billion software product. And so I was really able to see like the receiving end of compliance. Like I'd get a lot of compliance requests. I owned about 1,000 pieces of evidence. And let's just say I probably had some of the same reactions that I know many of us in the compliance world kind of have today from engineering. So we're going to talk about that. But also now I manage SaaS compliance for a large number of enterprise solutions. And so now I'm on the other side of the hat, kind of giving requirements back down. And so before I get started, and while people are joining, can you kind of give me a shout out in the comments of just basically like what role you have? Are you a corporate compliance person? Are you a third party auditor? Or even an engineer or security person? I'd love to get a sense of who's in the chat. And also just give me a shout out if everything's working appropriately. I think it is from what I see, but I'd like to double check that before we really get involved. So let me see here. It looks like it's going. So let me tell you this. Can everybody hear me? Is everything okay? Please, somebody give me a comment. Anyone? Maybe I'll give myself a test comment. Just to be sure. Awesome. Hey, Mark, thank you for that. Really appreciate it. So here's what we're going to start with. We're not going to get into a lot of Dr. Phil, but if you're interested in saving thousands of hours of engineering time that you can show on paper, and you don't want to be one of those people that's just in a cost overhead group, what I'd say is that the first step of understanding how to get things done with engineers is to understand the engineering mindset because there is a really big difference in a chat lag. We'll have to work on that later. So there's really a big difference in what there seems to be with the mindset of engineering versus compliance. Because if you think about compliance or any program for a senior leader, it falls in one of three buckets. You're either making money, costing money, or saving money. So the real question is compliance has always been seen as a cost overhead. But the first thing that we need to understand is how engineers think, kind of what their metrics are, and why a lot of it really is really different than kind of how we approach things with engineering. Because, I'm a military guy, so a lot of people, I know I use a lot of military terms, but Sun Tzu said, "Know thy enemy." And I don't think of engineering as an enemy, but really as a different kind of group of people that have different mindsets and they have different metrics. And so, what I found coming from engineering and going to compliance and vice versa is half the time we're talking apples and oranges. And so, we're going to get into that today. We're going to dive in. And so, what I'm going to ask people to do though is if you have questions, I'd love to get questions. Please do put them in the chat and please do kind of put a Q colon because I can sort through them a little easier. If I don't get to them during the discussion, I'll get to them at the end. So, with that, what I would say is let's start off with kind of why this is important. Now, it's important for a number of reasons, but I had a situation just the other day where I was referred somebody where their CEO told their compliance team, "You need to work better with the engineers." Well, duh, we all do that, right? I mean, it really comes down to how do we engage and how do we get things done? Because in the end, compliance, we have a number of things that we want to get done. I mean, obviously, we have to go through audits, we have to collect evidence. But if you think about those kind of metrics, those are not necessarily kind of aligning with what engineers feel are important. So before we get into that, we want to spend just a few minutes and talk about the actual compliance mindsets because that is really where everything kind of starts. I'm getting a technical issue here. Okay, there we go. So, okay, when we talk about in compliance, what does compliance measure? Throw it in the chat if you do. I'll read it out because first we have to understand for general compliance teams, what are the things that we normally kind of look at? I mean, I can tell you that normally when I was working with the compliance team when I was an engineer, It's all about numbers of evidence. Like they send me these requests for evidence. I'd get 1,000 of them and I'd have to go service them. But what I would tell you is that that metric in itself doesn't mean anything to engineers. We'll talk about that. The metric of completing an audit, maybe time in terms of schedule is something that we track. But again, when they would come to me with those things, it's really hard to understand how that impacted my day to day. And so really what I would say is, compliance's jobs usually is to complete audits, make sure we get through, because obviously the evidence is really important in order to complete the audit frameworks. And so tracking those things, which are always tracked with me, you got 1,000 pieces of evidence, Milan, where are they? Well, sure, I'm gathering them, and so they're going to take time. But it comes down to, as Mark says in here, meeting a set of control requirements. Now, the control requirements, again, are very important, but you got to think about like where they actually land. So in compliance, we try to measure risk, right? We have to go fix this issue or test these controls because there's risk to the company. But how do you measure that? For one, is unless you have like a CVSS score, you might be able to measure it, but how does that impact an engineer? And today we're going to talk about like why those traditional compliance metrics really do not impact the engineers in a way that allows them to meet their own goal and function, because it's really not measurable to them. And so I just wanted to briefly talk about the compliance piece of it, because I think we all kind of know that. Most of us here are probably from the compliance space. But the engineering mindset is where things start getting interesting, because we're going to spend a lot more time here. So in general, what do you hear from compliant or from the engineers half the time? They say, why do I have to give this stuff? This stuff is boring. I don't like to work on this stuff. I know I have to do it, but why is it so painful? How come you're always here asking for stuff? Why are you asking for stuff multiple times? I gave you what you asked for. So I think we've all kind of heard that over time. And what I can tell you is that what engineers track and what I used to track as an engineer was not anywhere in those things that we talked about. So why would I think that it would be important to actually do those things? Now, to be clear, every senior leader I've ever talked to, they all know compliance is important. Like they never question that, because it's the number one trust vehicle for customers in terms of passing audit reports, but it's also, obviously important for opening new markets. Almost any market or vertical you go into today has a new requirement or has a new certification, or a government has new requirements, and it's a growing space. So the real challenge that we get into is really about how do we do this at scale efficiently while we're showing we're adding value to engineers. And I'll tell you that the world has changed. In the old days, compliance would come rolling in with a bat, and engineering leaders knew they had to have a blank checkbook to do audits because they were required. But it never actually meant that it was efficient. And because what we'll talk about here in a minute is that if you don't track things for compliance in the way that the engineers care about, you're never going to be able to change what they do in order to get what you need out of it. Because in the end, it really comes down to what value are you providing to the engineers. Now, you can say that you shouldn't have to give them value. I mean, compliance is a requirement. But remember, it's competing. And as an engineering leader, it competed with every other thing that I was actually rated on. For example, did the new features get into the right branches? Did you fix all the regular feature bugs you had to go fix? Did you have to go fix bugs for operational excellence because we had downtime? All of that stuff usually booked up initially 100% of the engineer's time. Because when we started this process of compliance in the past, it never actually was scoped as part of the job. It always came after the fact. If you think, it wasn't too long ago, and for someone like me who's getting up there in age, software products and development used to move at a much slower pace. You would change out the software every 5 years when the hardware went into life, and that wasn't actually that long ago. So what's actually happened over time is that the development processes have increased, meaning in terms of speed to delivery. People are delivering new features quarterly, sometimes monthly, sometimes real time. but the compliance processes were still baked after this once a year process. And there actually, it's gotten so bad that the audit firms have had to increase the number of audits you do, not how it's done, but for example, with SOC for financial systems, you have to do 4 audits a year. Well, all that's doing is compressing a once a year cycle into 4. How inefficient's that? That's very inefficient to go pull all that stuff 4 times a year in order to go validate that you don't have drift in between all of these software changes. So the software engineering changed, but the compliance processes really didn't change. I mean, they're still the same archaic ones that we've been using. We throw more money at them, or we try to. We throw more bodies at them. But the amount of evidence at scale for a cloud solution is really hard to get that done. So the mindset of the engineer is that their currency that they deal with is not risk. It's not actually doing the evidence pieces, but what it really is time. Remember, engineering leaders, they work in sprints. So everything gets measured in time. And that's one of the most important changes of understanding mindset with engineers is that what they're using. So if you think about time, does time actually, is that something that compliance teams tend to track? How long things take to go do? Not really. I've never had it in the past. It was never asked of me. I mean, I was implementing that stuff on the engineering side solely because that was the metric that we used. You had sprints, and the sprints, things took time. When you go into writing Jira tickets or whatever tracking system you use for work, how many hours does it expect to take you? But compliance never really approached it that way, right? We pass down this PBC or this list of evidence requests, but nowhere do we track how that's going to become efficient. So for the engineers, it really comes down to understanding what they hate the most. So this is the big one for me. So throw it in the chat. What do you think engineers hate the most? Like in terms of getting, like just generally, not even with compliance. What do engineers really dislike? Because I can tell you that engineers really, they do care about certain things. And you got to remember that what they're rated on is usually writing new features, fixing feature bugs, right? Compliance might be thrown in there for things like security bugs or accessibility bugs, but actual audits, is that even in their workflow generally? If they're lucky, they have a good compliance team that tells them when the audit's going to start. But again, they don't have this sense of time about how to measure it. So that's one of the most important things to think about is that engineers really dislike certain things. Like Galen, that's a great point. They dislike things they can't automate. There's a reason for that because automation means they have to spend their personal time on it. So we'll talk about automation in a minute in a bit more detail. But what engineers really hate at the end of the day, and I know because I hated them as well, doing double work or work that doesn't make sense. Exactly. What they hate is ambiguous specifications without success criteria. And we'll talk about what that means from a mindset perspective. Remember, engineers love to give you what you ask for. So if the ask is ambiguous, incomplete, or the success criteria isn't clear, then that becomes an issue. And that becomes an issue because what does that cause? It causes 2 things. One, it's very inefficient, which means you have to go back to them for something else. But that also means it's unplanned work because it's extra work they didn't plan on. So if you think about those metrics, think of it like a bug regression, right? If they give you a piece of evidence and that evidence actually is bad, right? So then the compliance team has to come back either for a clarifying meeting with the engineer or just for more evidence because it was incomplete. What I would say is, whose fault is that? You could say it's the auditor's true. I mean, they ask for requests. But again, auditors don't always know the engineering. So it really comes down to those 2 factors. And when those 2 factors are really off, meaning that there's ambiguous specifications, which means they give you something they don't have confidence or they don't know if it's going to come back, and unplanned work or wasted effort. So now you're eating it in both ends as the compliance team, and you're not building trust at all, right? You're not building trust 1 iota when you have to go back. How many times in an audit do you have to go back when the auditors don't accept something? Anybody that works in compliance knows it happens. It's a regression rate, if you want to think of that. And so if you think in terms of engineering, that is how they think about what it means to be successful. Because if you can't give them a predictable schedule and a predictable set of asks, Well, now that's going to bleed in other things because, audits go long when the evidence isn't good. You have to keep pulling them in, and then it becomes a fire drill near the end. And more importantly to the engineers, you are now actually taking time away from things that they're actually rated on that they feel are more important. So you're always going to be fighting that, especially if they think you're inefficient. You're not going to get the behavior that you want. So how do you then go to change that? I wanted to go through that really quickly because the real meat and potatoes here is really about how do you start bridging those items. And so if you think about what I summarized, that risk and evidence collection is like an apple, and the engineers are talking about time, bug fixing, regression rates is an orange. You see the disconnect here, and that causes all this friction, right? This causes all the friction about what it means to do this work efficiently, especially work that they don't always consider to be, the most fun work to go do in engineering. I mean, the saying where I came from was, compliance was like the Mike Rowe or dirty job of engineering. You had to do it. Everybody knew you had to do it, but it wasn't like a shiny object that they would get rated on with their engineering leaders for adding direct customer value. So you have to take that into account as you're actually thinking about how do you set up for bridging this mindset between the things that the engineer talk about and the things that you talk about, and then getting what you want. And what I'll say is, we talked about the fact that the days of the bat and the blank checkbook are gone. I mean, you cannot throw dollars and money at this issue anymore because there's no way compliance teams are just going to add more people, or the leader is going to add more people to the compliance team to go just scale out to more and more evidence requests. And likewise, the engineers can't absorb it. They have too much work to go do. Everybody's squeezed for time, which is your budget. And so you have to get more efficient about understanding what's going to change their behavior to go fix things proactively. Now, that, from a mindset perspective, and the compliance team, I would say actually starts with your mission statement. Because if you want to bridge the minds with the engineers, your mission statement, in my opinion, should reflect kind of what it means for engineering. I'm going to give an example of this. So, for example, a lot of mission statements will talk about putting in compliance programs that will reduce the risk over time and open new markets. Okay, those were the metrics that we traditionally talk about, completing audits and opening new markets. But let's think outside the box for a minute and say, if the compliance team's mission statement was something more along the lines of, we're going to do compliance programs that will reduce the complexity, the cost, increase efficiency for engineering teams while reducing risk. If you think about the risk factors there, and so please don't put in the chat that managing risk is the most important thing for a compliance team. It is, and I'll talk about how you still get that. But the point being is that when the engineering leaders see that your goals align with making their lives more efficient and doing this work as cheaply as possible, it's really powerful because that's not the norm. And what I'll tell you is that you get reduction of risk by increasing the efficiency through automation, which we'll talk about here in a second, that Galen mentioned. But it's important because when you do things on a more predictable schedule with less regressions, with evidence coming back, you're actually decreasing risk because the evidence is going to be better, which means you can manage it more closely, which means you can automate it, and then you can actually write threshold monitoring against it. So the metrics, if you think about it like code, every regression costs 6 to 9 more times to fix for a production code for a feature than it does finding it up front. So if you change the metrics around more to what engineers do, what you can see then is this bridging of the minds where you're actually getting both what you need. Now, as you start doing that, what it really means is you start building trust. So getting creative with the metrics from a compliance standpoint is really crucial. If you think about it like the government, so what I just said was, the government wants to go fund a bill and they add all this other pork to it. Well, if you think about how I funded that bill with that mission statement, I actually added the risk mitigation as a part that we're not focusing on because you get that kind of for free. I mean, there are times where that will trump like a log4j, day zero. Of course, everybody jumps on those. But for the day-to-day things, remember, it's about building trust with engineers. And so if you think about regression rates, you can track that. You can track regression rates, you can track throughput of evidence, and that's how you start showing to the engineers that you're not wasting their time. And I'm going to do a different one that goes through the particulars of the actual metrics. But the mindset is where you have to start, because every team that you work on, every engineering team might track this stuff a slightly different way. Some track pure regression rates, some track throughput, some track, actual estimates of time. But that's where the soft science is of figuring out for your organization which one of those metrics they use, and then how do you actually adjust your compliance metrics in order to meet it. So, there's lots of different things that kind of drive engineers, features, bugs, how they're rated is something you have to keep in mind. So if you think about how engineers are rated, right? They're rated for writing these new features, fixing their engineering bugs, and compliance is just, it's a tax on top of that. Now, we know it's not a tax. The leaders don't believe it's a tax. But how many engineering teams get rated for this? Man, I fixed that accessibility or privacy bug today. Yeah. Okay, there might be one or two out there. But I can tell you as an engineer, that's not what I was necessarily rated on. And so keeping that in mind, what you can give engineers is, remember I talked about, making money, saving money, or costing money. Well, while compliance is always costing money, and you get a little bit of credit for opening new markets, but we don't actually do the bulk of the engineering work the engineers do. What you can start showing them is that you're saving them money in terms of time. Now, we talked about the regression rates, and we talked about how the fact that if you reduce those regression rates, and you can show that on paper, that will start building the trust with the engineers that you're not wasting their time, because everybody understands, at least initially, you have to collect the evidence at least once. Like, there's a request, you don't know what the third-party auditors are going to ask for. And so you have to go out to the teams to go gather that piece of evidence. And then that's kind of you have to do that once. But if you can show on paper that you're not doing it over and over, that you are in fact doing it once, that is extremely powerful to show the engineers that you're efficient. Now, you could take it to the next step. What Galen talked about is you could then look to remove them completely from the, from the workflow, saying, if you can collect it once and it's good, well, do you actually have to get that from the engineer? Can you actually maybe even automate it and remove them completely from the workflow? Because the ultimate goal here, as we talked about the rate of change for engineering, is to get to continuous compliance. I was talking to my manager and I said, look, the ultimate goal would be to where you could pump out an audit report for any framework that you're doing within 30 days. Because the most drift you'd have, if all the evidence is good and you're tracking it to make sure it doesn't drift, is you might have a 30-day to go fix a certain bug that came up, which is probably reasonable. Unless it's, again, a day zero, but we won't talk about that. That's an exception case. But remember, that's how we're changing the metrics in order to show engineering that we're actually partnering with them to give them what they want. Because I can tell you that through a process like this, it's able to show that we're saving tens of thousands of engineering hours by removing the regressions. Guess where they get to go use all that time that they didn't even realize they were spending because they were just complaining about it. They can go use that on other features. And the compliance teams that do that are the ones that are really going to build the confidence with engineering leaders. And then they're going to want to work with you to be more efficient, because it continues to drive that down to, like Galen said, automation. But that all starts with you track what you measure. And so if you're not measuring the right things, you're never actually going to be able to look at that and say, hey, this is really going to work for us. So when we're talking about like bridging that gap, there's lots of different things that engineers really don't understand kind of what that means. And so the question here is, can you expand on threshold monitoring in this context? Sure. So for example, this is one that I actually had. There's a certain, let's just say, scan result you get. Threshold, what's it called? Cross-site scripting. You should never find it actually in production, because you're supposed to find that in your scanning, your static dynamic scanning you do during code development. So if it gets through and you're finding this regularly, which if you're finding it once, you're going to find it regularly. That means some team is not checking that. Well, if you know things like that you're going to find, you can put in threshold monitoring to say, look, when the scan results are run, Why do we wait until the audit to recognize cross-site scripting and then go remediate it after the fact? Shouldn't there be threshold monitoring in place? So as somebody checks in that code within a day or two, it's found, flagged, a bug is filed, and routed to somebody to triage and get fixed. We find it in the quarterly PCI audits. It should be found somewhere down the road. Now, here's where the mindset on this one, I'll use this one kind of as an example. When we talk about metrics, there's another metric that's really important to engineering leaders. And that metric is downtime for customers. So, something that a lot of compliance teams don't do is when you go look at what a fix is, we go drive that fix. Oh, you got to go fix this bug. Well, okay, fine, we got to go fix it. But you may not necessarily have to fix it then. But if you're having a recurring problem and it's happening over and over, let's go analyze that bug. And let's say for that bug to go fix that issue in production, you would have to take the servers down to bounce it. And a lot of times, I won't talk about which bugs you do and which ones you don't do that for, but there are certain issues that when you find them in production, you have to go take customers down. So instead of focusing on the risk to that bug, focus on what the impact of that bug is if you have to go fix it in production. I've gotten a lot of bugs fixed proactively by saying, engineering leader, that bug, you find it in production late in a PCI audit in the last scan, you're going to have to take the servers down and bounce them in order to install that patch. Now, every system's different for your own company. You have to go research that. But when that happens, let me tell you, you're the one that's going to explain to the big cheese about why you did not fix that one early. Now you're on notice that, hey, I'm going to have to fix that late in the cycle to get through the audit. But if you fix it early, that bug, in order to fix it, and you have to do the research, you'll have to bounce the servers. Nobody wants to be that person who didn't go fix something that they knew about that would then take the customers down. Now, again, it's not necessarily a threat. It kind of is, but it's putting them on notice saying that bug or that issue, if you want to go fix it, you're going to be accountable for impacting customers, which I can tell you my senior leaders care about. Was that something, in the RCA after the fact, did you know about that issue? And if so, why didn't you fix it early? Very powerful tool to go drive, a different metric using SLA for customers, because a lot of the security and compliance things that you do will impact the customers. Because I can tell you that and this is used on me for years. If we don't get this done, it'll cost the company $4 billion. Yeah, right. Like, it doesn't hold any water. I mean, you can say that, but the chance of that happening are slim to nil. And likely, a lot of these issues that compliance teams inherit have been going on for a while, right? Because again, they're not getting the right focus, because again, the metrics that you use to talk to them are not something that's going to motivate them. Because you have to remember that the people that you're influencing are not the senior leaders who say you have to do compliance. It's the engineering leaders that are trying to balance this work with other priorities. So you have to put it in a way where it's going to resonate with the priorities that they feel are important with what they're getting rated on today. And we can agree or disagree about whether or not it should be that way. But the problem is that it's still not the most interesting thing for them to go do. And so going to the least common denominator, or the smallest amount of effort, tends to be what a lot of engineering teams for compliance think about, because they can get through it to some degree. And it's a really challenging discussion to use risk and impact of risk, because even in FedRAMP, you can carry some vulns, right? So how critical are those actually to fix? But if you talk about what that means to customer downtime, it changes the whole tenor of prioritization, because they do prioritize bugs on customer downtime. So that's where, if you want to bridge the mindset, the compliance teams have to move out of their comfort zone of only talking about it, from the compliance down. They have to understand what motivates the engineering teams and how they prioritize their work. Because if you can't bridge it into how they prioritize work, again, we're talking apples to oranges. And this has been probably the biggest thing as an engineering leader who also then came into compliance, is that it was never presented to me that way. And it wasn't until I got on the other side where you realize you have to go dig into the metrics and how to track it in order to bridge that understanding. And frankly, it is a bridging of understanding, because if you think about engineering teams, they don't traditionally think that way about compliance. So what I would say is in this revolution of compliance growth, what we're actually seeing is that we are slowly changing how we're doing compliance to map to the new development, whether it's DevSecOps or just the rate of innovation that's happening today. As a matter of fact, there's an article, I'll probably do a shorter video on this, that Bloomberg put out about how FedRAMP has to change because the warfighters cannot get the innovation to the field fast enough due to the compliance requirements to check it. Now, nobody wants to put unsafe products in the field, but it means we have to revamp it into a different model of how do you have compliance along the way, because the lift at the end is just not doable anymore with the rate of change because nothing's that stagnant. So remember, these processes were built on a much more stagnant architecture and development process that didn't change that much. So those really are kind of like the mindsets that kind of impact how to relate them together. And so what I'd love to, like, are there any other questions on this? Because I could go a little bit into, as a teaser, into kind of the metrics, but I want to do that in much more detail because I didn't let people know that I was going to be talking about that today. But are there any other questions regarding mindsets and how to influence engineers? Because I can tell you that these metrics and this mindset bridging has really worked for us. And I'd love to hear more thoughts from other people about, how they think about their engineers or challenges that they're having. Are there any that people want to talk about today? Some great comments here. Building a trust relationship, very important. Thanks, Mohammed. So again, the engineers that really talk about compliance, they all know it's important. So I don't want to take away, it is important, but how we have to talk about it as compliance experts to the engineers, that really has to change because you can't be using the same metrics that we're used to using. It just doesn't impact them anymore. And so I had one case I can tell you about when I started. Even changing the mindset about how we track things can be challenging because if you're coming from a more traditional compliance team where you're struggling with the friction with engineers, they're probably not used to two things. One is the compliance team. If you think about who makes up compliance teams mostly, they're not normally engineers who've done a lot of development, and that kind of makes it a little bit more difficult to understand and bridge that mindset of actions you have to go take. Because again, when I was an engineer, I didn't really understand how compliance was measuring success. I thought I knew what it was just by collecting the evidence and giving it to them. But as it kept coming back, I started to realize, well, it's not. It can't be that because that seems pretty inefficient. I would get asked for the same piece of evidence 3, 4, or 5 times. So I would, or get clarification, or I'd have to go get the engineer who actually was the control owner. So really what I would say is that over time, what's important is that you kind of map to those things for your organization. Now, how do you do that? Let's talk about that for a minute. So whenever you talk to your engineers, the first thing I would ask them is, okay, how do you measure the success for your development flow? Because the whole idea for me is mapping it to something that they're used to seeing in terms of regressions or flow rates. And so we go to your engineering leaders that are actually like the line managers or even the ones above that and say, okay, how do you prioritize your work? What are the things you use to prioritize features and bugs? Right. And through those discussions, what you'll find is that they'll start talking about things like, oh, Sev 0 bugs, Sev 1 bugs. Well, those definitions are important because those definitions are usually what set the ground rules for what they prioritize the critical bugs. A lot of times those have to do with critical known public security vulnerabilities or patches. A lot of times it's around downtime. And I think downtime is the one that compliance teams don't use enough because fixing those bugs, if you find them in production, could have significant downtime. And if they do or have any downtime at all, that goes back to that discussion about understanding what's going to motivate them to change their priority schema to bump up the compliance work. So then the other thing I will tell you is that once you get more efficient, then you can start scheduling them for specific sprints, which also builds trust. I can tell you in my previous job before this one, when I was an engineering leader, I collected about 1,000 pieces of evidence in 2 weeks with a 95% accuracy that it was going to be good and make it through the audit. But what does that mean? That means that I don't get hit with unplanned work. The unplanned work is the piece that really kills engineering because I had full sprints planned. As a matter of fact, I cleared the decks for that 2 weeks. There was no development going on in those 2 weeks. for those people that were actually, control owners teams. So that was the 2 weeks for them to do the audit. And so I held the compliance team very accountable for things that came back that we'd already kind of agreed that should be good. So that's an area where if you understand what's important for the engineers time-wise, it can really help you with understanding kind of the what's important to them and how they're actually going to prioritize your work, because that builds the trust. Once you get to that point where they know that you've eliminated, 90+% of the waste that comes with regressions or, evidence that comes back, or you have to pull them into a meeting, well, now you can also then start automating it because you know it's good. And then you start showing them on paper how you can reduce that time. And that then really kind of will not only bridge the mindset, but that builds the trust that you have to do even more work to eliminate even more waste in the system. So I'm going to kind of stop there. I'll hang out for a minute or two to see if there's any questions, because the next one I'm really going to talk about the details of the actual metrics, because I'm going to have to go through a number of them in a bit more detail. And I want to make sure that the people who want to see the actual metrics have an opportunity to join in. So are there any questions regarding mindsets or how to deal with engineers that I can kind of answer for you coming from both sides? Go through some of these comments. Okay, here's a question. I'll throw this up here. What is quite a task to type dollar value, loss at risk, enablement perspective, number of control implementations? I'm not sure I understand the question, Eugene. Could you expand on it a little bit more? I think what you're talking about, well, the number of controls, I mean, that's an efficiency schema, I think, where you could say that if you can map controls across multiple frameworks, that should reduce your work, right? That's an efficiency scale item. Whereas if you can use a control over, say, SOC and SOX, or just a number of different areas, well, then you don't have to collect it more than once. And I think that is something when you think about efficiency, you also have to think about where can you reuse evidence. And that requires some kind of system. I mean, a lot of people will use the Archer or whatever to map things, but it just means that you need to go do that. And then the cost of that will go down if you can then reuse the evidence and not have to ask for multiple times. Now, I can tell you that asking for evidence multiple times from different for different frameworks, from different compliance people, from the same engineering team, that also shows a lack of efficiency, and that also then detracts from trust as well. Let's see if there's any other questions here. Well, I don't see any more questions, but what I would say is if you have items, I don't want to keep people any longer than we have to. If you have questions, please put them down in the comments of the video afterwards. I'd be happy to address those. If there are specific topics you would like to talk about as well, please put them down there. And the next solo one I will do with the actual metrics of what I actually use today and what my team uses in order to show how you can save thousands of hours of engineering and really start building that trust and that engagement with the engineers using this mindset, because it does all go back to what does it mean? What are the success criteria that both teams use, and really is incumbent on the compliance team in order to shift those metrics over to something that the engineering teams actually use for prioritizing the work that you need. And once you do get there, I can tell you the conversation will be much easier. And not only will it be easier, they'll look at you in a much more partnering way, because what you're really caring about in the end is their efficiency. I mean, I even told my team that at times our team efficiency is secondary to the engineering team efficiency because they're much larger. And again, the criteria that they use is different than ours. So I really hope this has been helpful to you. And again, I'd love some comments. And if you do have comments or things you'd like to see, please do put them down below. I hope everyone has a great day and this has been helpful to you. Until next time.